Please welcome to the stage Paul Austin of Third Wave and our esteemed panel.
So just by a show of hands, how many of you are familiar with psychedelics? You've heard about them, you've read an article, you've read a book, you've listened to a podcast, you've done them yourself maybe at some point. So some of you. And so my invitation for the rest of you, and really for everyone who's here today, is to really keep an open mind about what we're going to explore, because this really looks like it's going to revolutionize mental health, the way that we treat PTSD, depression, addiction. And the fact is, these medicines, although they are new in 2022 in many ways, they're also very ancient. We as humans have been using psychedelics and plant medicines for thousands of years. It's believed that Plato and Aristotle participated in these plant medicine ceremonies in ancient Greece, and that the core of Western philosophy really came from their experiences with plant medicine. And only recently, in the 50s and 60s, was there a resurgence. It kind of came back on the Western mindset with the invention of LSD in 1938. And unfortunately, although we had 1,000 clinical papers published on the efficacy of LSD, there was a counterculture and there was a backlash. And so there's been a hiatus on our exploration with these substances for the last 50 years. And so for today's panel, we'll get to explore this incredible and important topic around mental health and collective evolution. So first of all, we have Dr. Rachel Yehuda, professor and vice chairperson of psychiatry at Mount Sinai here in New York, Courtney Barnes, who is counsel at Feldman Legal Advisors, and Alex Wolfe, the COO and co-founder of Circadian Wellness. And so Rachel, I'd love to start with you. And if you could just give us an overview of the current clinical research on psychedelics. What does that landscape look like?
Well, thank you for asking that. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm so excited about the potential for psychedelic-assisted therapy in mental health. And I'm not just talking about adding yet another medication to the problem of mental health, but rather that the compounds like MDMA that you might know as ecstasy, or psilocybin that you might know as magic mushrooms, might have the potential to really offer us a new paradigm of care in mental health treatment. That's what the revolution is potentially about. So what we're talking about here, I want to just explain this. What we're talking about here is that for conditions like trauma or depression or anxiety or addiction, our current strategies are about taking a medicine to maybe suppress the symptoms, dampen them down so that you don't feel anything, and invariably, if you stop taking the medicine, assuming that it works for you, those symptoms might come back. But here we're talking about occasioning an experience that lets you cross over to the other side. What does that mean? You might have a profound insight while you're taking a psychedelic drug. That insight might promote a sense of self-compassion, so important for trauma survivors, or reduce fear and allow you to look at something in a very different way, or really have you come to understand why you're anxious or why you engage in an addictive behavior. We have to stop telling patients that the best they can hope for is to not be miserable. The true pursuit of happiness awaits them with maybe a very different approach, and that's why we established the Center for Psychedelic Therapy and Trauma Research at the Mount Sinai School of Medicine, so that we could better investigate this new model of care.
And we'll get deeper into some of the neuroscience and sort of how this happens. And Courtney, I'd love to propose the next question to you around policy. This early clinical research, how has it informed the legal landscape of psychedelics? What's currently legal or soon to be legal as it relates to these powerful compounds?
Sure. So as you mentioned, we are sort of turning the corner after 50 years of prohibition. So compounds, controlled substances or drugs, are regulated at both the federal and state level. And your classic psychedelic compounds, so MDMA, psilocybin, LSD, are all continue to be regulated as Schedule I controlled substances. This means that the federal government views them as having a high potential for abuse, no accepted safety for use under medical supervision, and a lack of accepted sort of efficacy within the medical community. And since that time, though, we now have 17 cities across the United States that have passed some sort of decriminalization, local legislation, making it the city's lowest law enforcement priority to prosecute individuals engaging in activities with psychedelics. We also have Oregon, which will be the first state in the country with a medical access model where you'll be able to go to a treatment center and have an experience using psilocybin with a trained facilitator at the state level. And you don't need to have a particular indication to go and access these services. You just need to be an adult. That will be implemented at the beginning of next year. And we also have, as Rachel mentioned, MDMA and psilocybin that will likely be FDA approved for therapy-assisted use in the next 2 years. So we have a long way to go, but it's a really incredible time for the psychedelic movement.
And Oregon will be going into effect in about 4 to 5 months. So within a short time frame, people in the United States can legally access psychedelic medicine for their own benefit. And that comes to you, Alex. You know, your background is in cannabis, and now with Circadian Wellness, you're looking at that intersection between functional mushrooms and psychedelic mushrooms. Tell us a little bit about that overlap. What are functional mushrooms? How are they opening a space for psychedelic mushrooms?
Right. Well, I'll start with how I see the industry going and how functional mushrooms plays a part in that. I see the industry taking a very colorful road to legalization. I see active legislation and more support with groups like MAPS, helping with decriminalization in many more cities across America, and at the state level, more legalization like states like Oregon coming on board. And then I see a few obstacles, but then I see these obstacles being overcome by more clinical trials and more observational studies. And you know, not to mention, we're in a renaissance period of psychedelics right now. There's more and more experiential use, and that's getting a lot of attention from big business, from corporations, and the banking sector. And tens of millions of dollars are pouring into this industry, which will help all the above. And that's very inspiring, because we're going to see some really cool companies emerge that are making amazing products, and more importantly, amazing protocols of how to use these products that can really help people heal, help them work with their trauma, and help them live a better life on a daily basis. And that's really inspiring for me. And I know I'm being optimistic and keeping an open mind here, Paul, but I envision a world where people are attuned to themselves and to the world around them with access to these medicines that have very minimal side effects. And that's really inspiring. And that brings me to the point with functional mushrooms. You know, functional mushrooms have been around for eons. They are completely legal, and they help. The data shows that they help people with every part of their circadian rhythm. You know, so if we could get people familiar with taking mushrooms that have been around forever, it gives them a better sleep. It gives them more energy so they could go outside and exercise and go to the gym. It gives them more cognitive function so they can upload more data or stay calm and focused at work. It even increases their libido so they can have an enhanced love life. You know, we're really getting people to live their best life, and that to me is we're building the on-ramp with functional mushrooms to the bridge of psychedelics. And I see psychedelics as a bridge to wellness, and we're building that on-ramp to the bridge with functional mushrooms.
And that speaks to one of the tensions in the psychedelic space, you know, clinical, medical, therapeutic versus wellness, leadership, performance. Because the truth is, everyone to some degree can benefit, and yet the people who need this most are often those who've been struggling with PTSD or depression for decades sometimes, and nothing else has worked. And that comes into the current research. And I'd love if you could just tell us a little bit about MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. What are we seeing in terms of efficacy for PTSD? And also a little bit about psilocybin-assisted therapy for depression and alcoholism.
So MDMA-assisted psychotherapy is very, very exciting. The MAPS program just completed the second of 2 phase 3 trials. The first one had magnificent results. About 2/3 of patients that received MDMA-assisted psychotherapy no longer had PTSD, which is really phenomenal and better than the state of care. But what's really important to understand about MDMA and psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy is the assisted psychotherapy part. These medicines are given in the context of a psychotherapeutic process, and the therapy is performed by very well-trained clinicians. And this is true even in depression. So it's not really the case in mental health, where you ingest the psychedelic and then you're magically cured. It's part of a process of working to achieve an insight. And in fact, for a third of the patients that didn't do as well, or maybe still had their PTSD, it becomes a real question to understand why some people benefit, who's most likely to benefit, who doesn't, whether it's just a matter of more psychedelics or a different approach altogether. And so the science becomes really important here. So in addition to doing clinical trials, you have to be able to use effective biomarker tools to try to understand not only mechanism of action, but to be able to predict who might respond well to psychedelic psychotherapy and who might not, and what that looks like when it's over. Can we use objective markers to be able to understand when someone has really achieved a place where they no longer have the diagnosis, which is a very, very high bar in mental health. The other important thing that has to be done is that we have to train a new generation of therapists in how to work with psychedelic-assisted medicines. And trust me, it's a little bit different than the current standard of care of receiving cognitive behavioral therapies or more short-term approaches and even longer-term approaches. So in our center, we are going to embark on the task of training therapists, particularly those who work in community settings, for a day when hopefully these medicines can be adopted. The most important thing that I can say about these medicines that have come from clinical trials has been the patients don't drop out of these approaches. In the typical PTSD study, up to a third or half the patients can vote with their feet, so to speak. In the case of trauma, it is very distressing to talk about trauma in the context of a psychological treatment, and medicines often give side effects. In the clinical trials to date that have been performed on MDMA, you have a very low dropout rate. So any therapy that a person is going to stick with has a lot of potential. Why are they sticking with it? Because it's an experience that also produces an inner gentleness. Even though it's tough to relive memories, you have the support that allows you to do it. And fundamentally, even through maybe a difficult journey sometimes, you reach to the other side. But more often, patients become engaged in a deeply relaxing inner experience. It's called ecstasy also for a reason, although some people say, why is it called ecstasy? Both things happen. But again, it's a different approach, something that might work better than the current standard of care, and something that we have to be really excited about after doing a very careful vetting through research.
And one thing to emphasize is we don't necessarily see this as a panacea. It's not a fix-all. What Rachel is speaking to is the future of healthcare is really about personalized approaches. It's not so much a pill, but what I would call a skill of psychedelics, right? And how can we skillfully use these with other holistic practices, meditation, breathwork, yoga, diet, sleep, to improve overall well-being. And so, Courtney, when it comes to legal policy, you already talked a little bit about where are we currently. How do you see the sort of path towards, let's say, full legalization here in the United States, looking at decrim state by state and then medical use of psychedelics?
Sure. So what we're already seeing, and I think as you kind of just touched on, is there's no one-size-fits-all approach to regulation. There's a large segment of the population that won't want to access these compounds in an FDA clinical setting. However, there's an equally important part of the population that will only access these healing modalities if it's FDA approved and through a prescription and regulated state. So we have this sort of community-based healing model of your sort of retreat centers that you can engage in these healing experiences with a group of people under a guided facilitator that's been doing this potentially for generations. And we have this decriminalization approach, which is sort of the right to explore your consciousness and to seek to improve your well-being and spirituality by having the right to put whatever you believe should be put into your body so long as it's not harming other people. And then we have this critically important drug development medical model that will really, I think, expand access to those who may be more hesitant to try these compounds otherwise. So hopefully we'll continue to see all three of those models respected and the growth there for each, because we really can't make global, effective, permanent change without having a access model that sort of caters to all of the different types of people out there. So that's what I hope and I think we'll see in the next sort of 5 to 10 years.
And I think one key element of this, besides mental health, is also the war on drugs, and how clearly drugs have won the war on drugs, and that the entire drug policy that we currently have is ineffective. And so legalizing psychedelics, just like we've seen with cannabis, will have an outsized effect also on community healing and the health of communities. So Alex, last question for you is just, looking at the future of psychedelics and leadership, tell us a little bit about how your own psychedelic work has influenced your leadership style, has influenced the way that you show up in your life with your loved ones and your friends. What does that look like for you?
Sure. Well, just on a very personal level, plant medicine changed my life several years ago. In Peru, I did an ayahuasca ceremony with a shaman, and that set me on the quest into the cannabis industry. Wanted to help as many people as I could in the cannabis industry, and then later in CBD in the United States. And that was great. It was a great experience. But compared to now, with the messages I get every day on a daily basis from people thanking me for introducing them to mushrooms, eclipses the work I did in cannabis for 3 years, or 3.5 years. It's remarkable, and that's what keeps me going in this industry. Is every day people message me saying, "Thank God, thank you for introducing me to mushrooms," and it's super inspiring. And for me, on a personal level, I take functional mushrooms every day. Like I said, they help every aspect of my circadian rhythm. They help me be in that peak state for myself and my team and my family and friends, and it's phenomenal. And I microdose mushrooms as well. I find it brings me into awareness within my body and my heart center. And I lead my team now from my heart, where the rest of my career, I was very much in my head. I was a commercial pilot for 18 years and always thinking ahead and that kind of stuff. But now I have a coherence with my heart and my head for the first time in my life. And it's phenomenal. It's changed relationships with family and friends and just the way that I connect with people on a day-to-day business level. And I've introduced this to other CEOs and management across the country, and they thank me every day also. It's changing the way we do business, and slowly but surely, but I love it, and thanks for asking, Paul.
And to hit on your last point, so there's a phenomenal quote by Buckminster Fuller, who is a well-known futurist, and he said, "There's no point in trying to fix an obsolete system. Let's create a new system that makes the old system obsolete." So let's not fix the broken, create the new paradigm. And I think what psychedelics are teaching us in these journey doses, in these high doses, is this truth of interconnectedness, how everything around us is interconnected, and how we have to build new systems for mental health, new systems for business, new systems for policy that are based in that understanding. We've lived too long in an extractive way, in a separated way, in a disconnected way. It's really at the core of the existential crisis that we're faced with. And so to have a medicine that helps us to remember that truth will be central to this new paradigm that's emerging. Thank you for your attention today. It's been an honor to be here to talk about psychedelics and the revolution in mental health.